All right, I'll go ahead and I guess start my introduction then. Um, I can't see everyone in the room right now, so it's kind of weird talking to. Um, I see three boxes, but I know there's a bunch more of you out there. Um, my name is Jacob Heiser. I'm a piano faculty at UMass Lowell, although I also teach piano ensemble and sometimes M&A and keyboard for Rangers and sometimes keyboard lab. Um, just a little bit about myself. I play piano and violin. I do all different kinds of music. Grew up playing bluegrass fiddle and blues piano, and then played an orchestra and did lots of classical stuff and rock bands as a teenager, and just kind of been all over the place. Although my current main interest is jazz or jazz related musics. Um, anyway, that's enough about myself. Um, a couple logistical things before I get too deep into this. Um, if one of the grad assistants could drop the recital form in the chat for those of you who need to attend this for recital credit. Um, Thank you. And also, I highly recommend headphones for this session because there will be some recordings that would benefit um, if you can hear it, like your or nice speakers or headphones would be good. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. So, my theme for tonight is this idea of invisible threads, and those are figures that are often to me they're figures that are often overlooked in music history or in the general sort of like mainstream listener groups. Um, so lately, I've been interested in this idea of musical genealogy, kind of like how musical ideas get encoded in musical DNA, so to speak, and then they get passed through generations of people. I'm particularly interested in artists whose musical DNA doesn't get replicated as often as canonic figures such as Bach or Beethoven or John Coltrane or the Beatles. Um, Sometimes these less visible artists are dismissed as being forgotten or underappreciated because um, they're not deemed as like geniuses like those who history deems worthy of remembrance. That mindset sort of assumes that history is some purifying force that sifts out impurities and leaves only the best, only the gold. But we know that history is actually an intentionally curated picture of a particular time and space, a curation process that continues to the present and reflects the values of those curating that picture, so that anyone who doesn't reflect the values of those curators doesn't deserve to be remembered in their view. And a few common reasons for the dismissal of these ghosts of history, and relevant to the figures that I'm going to share in this session, are one, they left behind too little creative material as evidence. Um, they belong to a racial or gender category that was regularly dismissed as inferior. They were creating work that didn't reflect the current trends or artistic values, or they died young, often because of economic hardship or social oppression or depression. And all those things can be caused by lack of recognition for their perceived efforts. So, one of the wonderful things about the advent of audio recording in the 20th century is that these otherwise forgotten voices are more easily remembered than ever before. Um, as recording technology became more accessible, it was more likely than not that these otherwise lost voices became immortalized in a recording. And recordings now offer a somewhat direct experience of how these people sounded. Rather than relying on a written description or notated music, we can actually hear their voices, how they spoke through their music with our own ears. So today I'm focusing on four particular figures in jazz or Black American music: Mary Lou Williams, Richard Twardzik, Henry Threadgill, and Jerry Allen. It was really difficult for me to narrow these down because I started out with about 16 people. Then I narrowed it down to about 10. Then I narrowed it down to 8. Then now I'm down to 4. And if we had all day or a few days straight, then I would gladly share all of my obsessions with you. But I think these 4 will give a nice kind of overview of some different streams of jazz in the 20th century. So where was I going? I just lost my thread. Okay. So at the end of the session, I'm going to share a link to a document that has a fuller list of people that I would have included, and you can peruse that at your own. You can peruse that at your own discretion. So each of these 4 figures that I am going to cover are singular in the fact that they unapologetically drew from sources that inspired them, even if they weren't the fashionable or the trendy ones of the time. And as I said before, that mindset tends to get you overlooked by the rest of the community because there's such a strong social pressure to conform to what everyone else is doing. So all of that set up to I want you to think about these questions, especially musicians out there that are wanting to be professional musicians. Do we actually like what we claim to like? We're told over and over again that we're supposed to like certain figures like Bach, Beethoven, Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Beatles, whatever. But those loud, dominant voices are constantly reinforced over and over and over again by parents and teachers and peers. They become entrenched in ourselves. And so then we pass those entrenched, inherited preferences to the next generation, either as our children or as students. As much as I enjoy those canonic figures, and I know a lot of you know that I'm absolutely in love with Brahms, and he's one of them. As much as I love those people, this creates the obsession with these canonic figures creates a couple of problems for me. Drawing on the same sources generation after generation creates, for lack of a better example, a sort of inbreeding effect where everyone shares the same musical DNA and basically become clones of each other. So there's a lack of, to have a biology analogy. It's kind of like a lack of musical biodiversity, so to speak. And in nature, although I also think also in music, biodiversity is a measure of an ecosystem's health. So, and then secondly, on a more individual, personal level, young musicians like myself are told what we're supposed to like and what kinds of musical choices what we're supposed to make, as if there's some universal how-to list of musical success that works for every single person. We don't usually make an effort to step back and ask, are those values actually our values? Do we draw inspiration? Do we really draw inspiration from those sort of dominant forces and sources? Are we actually ourselves, or are we trying to mold ourselves in the image of others? And so all that introduction just to kind of set up what we're going to do, what we're going to listen to for the rest of this session. The first figure we're going to talk about, I'm going to go in sort of a chronological order, is Mary Lou Williams. So some of the more insider people in jazz history might be like, why are you talking about Mary Lou Williams? We know who she is. But the thing is, she's not really held to the same level as other figures. So even non-jazz people will be like, okay, Miles Davis, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock. You know those names. Some of you probably do. But unless you really know jazz history, you probably won't pay that much attention to Mary Lou Williams, even though she was a huge effect on many voices around her of her time. So anyway, I'm going to try to not talk quite as much as I did at the beginning so we don't run out of time, but I'll give little brief sort of introductions to each of these people. But first of all, I want you to hear Mary Lou play, or watch Mary Lou play. So let me pull up this. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So I feel like that was her when she was a year before she passed away in 1980. Um, but I feel like that was a kind of like a good intro to her roots because she grew up playing a lot of blues. She was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She learned piano by ear as a kid from her mom, who played piano and organ. She actually didn't end up being able to read music until she was in her mid to late 20s. Um, so she became popular around the neighborhood that she grew up in as a little kid because she would go around to her neighbors' houses and play piano. And they would feed her and give her tips. And so she made pretty good money as a kid, just like playing at her neighbors' homes. As a teenager, she started touring with some vaudeville shows that did a lot of sort of like kind of um, semi minstrel shows where she had a lot of. I'm not going to get too much into biography things, but she had a lot of rough experiences there. But she kind of got a taste of like the professional music world at that time, which was very, very rough, especially for a woman. Um, so while she was on the shows, she kind of like embraced this idea of being super showy with how she played. But then she was told by an audience member at one point that she should stop showing off and just play good music. And she actually, I remembered that she was told that when she was 15, and then she kept remembered that for the rest of her life. So one thing, as we listen to some of her later music, um, you'll find that she's pretty subdued in like how she presents herself. She doesn't feel a need to always show off her virtuosity, um, which might be contribute to why she was overlooked sometimes. Um, and then she started playing with this. She hit the big time with this band called Andy Kirk Orchestra in Oklahoma City and Kansas City. She rubbed shoulders with Charlie Parker and Count Basie um, and a bunch of people in the Kansas City scene. Um, while she was playing with Andy Kirk's band, while she was arranging for that band without knowing how to notate the music. So what she would do is she would teach the band the music by ear, hearing all the parts in her head, and then teaching the band how to play it. A few years later, she after doing that for a while, she eventually learned how to notate music. But it's just kind of amazing that someone can hear an orchestra in their head and just teach a group that by ear. So she continued playing with them through the 40s, and then embarked on some solo projects in the later 40s. Became friends with Thelonious Monk and was a huge influence on him. He actually stole some of her songs and incorporated them into her own, but they still remain good friends. In the 50s, she took a 3-year break from performing because she just got tired of the road life. And so in 1954, she just took 3 years off, didn't play piano. I think she didn't really even play piano at all. I don't think she touched the instrument, as far as I know. But during those 3 years, she helped a bunch of her fellow jazz musicians who had addiction issues. She used her own apartment in New York as a halfway house to help recovering musicians to get back on their feet again. And then during that time, she converted Catholicism, and she was the devout Catholic for the rest of her life. And it's really only thanks to some priests who got to know her during that hiatus that they eventually persuaded her to return to music again. So after that point, she started performing again in the 60s and 70s, started teaching at Duke University for the last few years of her life, and then passed away in 1981. So now we're gonna listen to a couple of her tracks. This first one is one of her recordings from the 40s. And it's not her original tune, but it's an arrangement she did of this early jazz standard called "I Found a New Baby." And as we listen to it, a couple things I want you to notice. Let me do this. Here. A couple things I want you to notice is notice how lean, how sparse the arrangement is. It's not super dense. There's not like a lot of like high intensity stuff going on, like a lot of the bebop recordings that were happening at the same time. She's not obligated to fill up space. And also listen for what she does with tempo changes, or like this idea of like slow, fast pacing. So yeah, here we go. Those tempo changes get me every time. Just like, I don't know. They just like catch me by surprise. Like nobody else at the time was really doing that. They would like do double time or half time, but she's doing these sort of like in between, not quite double time, not quite half time. It just feels like somebody just shifted the gears really hard, and now we're going a completely different direction. Um, Also, as we go, I encourage if anybody, I don't want to make it too chaotic in here, but if anybody has any like burning thoughts or burning comments after listening to something, feel free to say something. I don't want to totally dominate the space here. Um, if nobody has anything for this one, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is, so I'm going to play approximately 2 recordings per people. And so this is the second one. This one's called The Devil, which is inspired by her conversion to Catholicism because it was written and recorded right after her hiatus, her return to performing again. Honestly, for me, this is like, I really don't like jazz choir that much. A lot of the arrangements I heard, personally, I don't find very good, but that's my own snobbery. But I love this because I think she does it better than anyone else that I've heard. So let me share. Somebody's okay. Share screen. Here we go.
The devil is a woman with a red dress on, a gleam that flits across a roving eye. The devil is a hand that moves along a satin seam, a softly whispered, sweetly whispered lie. The devil is a window filled with fancy clothes, 2 lips that part and smile and breathe a sigh. An open door someplace where steps that shouldn't go, there goes a word that touched a heart and made it cry.
Where are you gonna run? Where do you think you're gonna hide? What makes you think you're slick enough to take old Satan for a ride? Ain't you never took a notice that no matter what you do, our old friend Mephistopheles gets there just ahead of you?
The devil never rests, come day, come dusk, come dawn. You compromise and wind up soul in pawn. So don't it strike you funny when you look him in the eye? The devil looks a lot like you and I. Our old friend Mephistopheles
Isn't that awesome?
That was genuinely mind-bending.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, it's really kind of a crime that her choral music doesn't get played, performed more, because it's good. It's very, very good. She wrote a whole mass a few years after this recording. Um, it's so good. Like, I mean, just I would love for the choirs that I work with to do her music more. I'm working on it. Anyway, any other comments on that before we press forward? Oh yeah, I actually asked Jonathan Richter about collaborating on this piece. By the way, just a spoiler alert. So it might happen at UML in the near future. Yeah, I love that because it's like the melody is primarily in the bass. You know, it usually sits on top. It's just like the gravity is all down here, and then everything else, other than the bridge sections, it floats on top. It's really beautiful. And then these like surprising silences and harmonic turns, kind of like jerks you all over the place. It's so good. I can listen to that recording forever. Um, yeah. Any other comments, or should I press on?
There was like you said, some cool harmonic turns in there. Do you happen to know when that piece was written? You said that was it the same time as like Hard Bop was going on?
It was around that same time. Yes, definitely. It was. I think she might have actually written the music in before her conversion to Catholicism, and then she had a lyricist put words to it in
Oh,
'58.
cool.
I think she wrote it in '52, so maybe a little before Hard Bop. Um, yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
She was doing that kind of harmonic stuff though. Um, if we had time, I would show you all the examples of like all the crazy stuff she was doing. But she was doing some of that stuff in the late 20s in recordings that you can hear. Not quite in the same sort of like idiom because it's a little earlier, but those harmonies were already present early on, and so she was actually a big influence on a lot of the people who followed her with her sort of adventurousness.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Cool. Any others, or should I press forward? Cool. All right. Also, if anyone's raising their hands, I can't see you because I can't see everyone at once. So, um, let's see. Our next figure is a very obscure figure that even people who aren't in, or for people who are well versed in jazz, most of them have not heard of him. So, Richard Twardzik, he was born in the early 30s, 31, I think. I can't remember off the top of my head, but born and raised in Boston. He's a very local figure. Both of his parents were artists. His mom did more like technical drawing stuff for MIT, and his dad was a painter who also did a lot of stained glass designs. So the BU Chapel is done by him, or some of it is done by him. Princeton's Chapel, St. Patrick's and St. John's cathedrals in New York City are also done by him. Richard's dad, not Richard himself. So as a kid, when Richard was a kid, he was encouraged by his mom to pursue piano because his mom actually really wanted to play piano and she just never did. Similar story to mine. My dad have a similar sort of thing. He always wanted to do music, and I lived out his dream. Anyway, so I just want to read this kind of quote of hers because she there's some surviving notes that she wrote about her son's life. So here's her notes. Now we are 10-ish. School piccolo, drummer with kettle lids, piano in kitchen. Mozart, Count Basie and cowboy hat. Liebestrom, the dog, and the fire escape. Stravinsky forced on schoolmates. Boys downstairs, first lessons, boogie woogie. He was taking lessons, but he played his way and played what he wanted. So just kind of like this little sort of stream of consciousness snapshot into his childhood. So when he got a little older, he studied piano with a kind of a famed piano teacher at the time, Madame Shaloff, who taught at NEC, and he also sort of studied informally at NEC, although there's no proof that he was officially enrolled, but he was around there and participating in some of the classes ensembles. So her son, Madame Shaloff's son, was Serge Shaloff, who is, if you're a sax player and sort of know a bit about jazz sax history, he was one of like the first like really kind of virtuoso baritone saxophone jazz improvisers. Played a lot with Woody Herman and Jimmy Dorsey and Count Basie for a bit. So then Twardzik and him became friends eventually. Twardzik played in a house band with Charlie Parker and Mingus and Roy Haynes whenever they would come to town. He would be their house pianist. And there's some records of, there's actually a recording of Charlie Parker and Twardzik playing together, which is very interesting. So a couple years before he died at the age of 24, very sadly. He recorded one trio album where he had 3 original tunes and then 3 covers, and it was only like a half album because he shared the album with another pianist, Russ Freeman, who was Chet Baker's pianist at the time, and Russ Freeman kind of got Richard Twardzik on this label recording. There are a few other kind of bootleg recordings of Twardzik playing with some other people. The quality's not that great, but there's been more and more kind of resurfacing in recent years, which has been awesome. Eventually, he did get hired to play with Chet Baker, and he toured Europe in 1955, I think. And they were there for a few months, and then he died of a heroin overdose, I think a few days before they were supposed to do a recording session in Paris. Yeah, really, really sad ending, way too early. But anyway, so let's listen to some of his music and some things I want you to keep in mind while we're listening to. I'm just gonna go play through both of them so we don't stop in between. A couple things I want you to think of while we're listening is he wasn't really too concerned with linear history, like this idea of musical prerequisite. He kind of drew on whatever was around him at the time. So he was listening to Bartok and Schoenberg. He would draw on some of their harmonic language. He was really into Bud Powell, so you hear some bebop lines. He played a lot of boogie woogie, so you hear some of that. He was also into like stride piano of Fats Waller and those James B. Johnson and those guys. So you'll hear a lot of different things. And then on top of that, the way he writes and the way he improvises, it tends to be, like in a lot of composition, we tend to like, okay, it has to have a logical development. It has a natural arc. It reaches the climax and then it ends. That is not how he thinks. He's very episodic. So he'll like play an idea, then he'll just like, it's like a hard cut scene to a completely different idea that may be totally unrelated. And then he'll keep doing the same thing. So the way he writes and the way he improvises, you'll hear evidence of both of those things. A quote by him actually about that album that we're going to listen to is, "Development is not my primary consideration. The ability to project ever-changing emotions or moods plus rhythmic freedom is far more important to me." So here we go. Without further ado, here's some Richard Twardzik. Actually, I have to stop just for a second because I just love that ending. It's just like, duh, duh. It just resolves to a completely different place. Um, also, um, does anybody have any reactions to that? No. So that moment where he's going da da do da da do da, that's actually borrowed from a Debussy piece, and I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head. Unfortunately, yeah, I can't remember. Um, so just like these little episodic nuggets of things. And then in the middle of that solo, he did sort of like stride piano thing going on, and then he just like chopped it off out of nowhere and just went another direction. Anyway, I'm just nerding out for a second. Let's continue. Also, let me do this. I meant to do this so you could see pictures. This is Richard Twardzik here. Let me start. Music. Here we go. Yeah, very. Oh, excuse me. Very kind of a wild energy, very chaotic energy for sure, right? He recorded that in 1954, so just like yes, everyone says that. Joy to the world. Everyone here says that. I know. I didn't think of it when I first heard it, but da 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 da. I think my favorite part of that is like this sort of like the silences. Just like you don't really hear that in other jazz happening at the time. These sort of like random sort of snippets of motives and then just stopping the motion, not really in a meter. They just kind of like stop, and then they start again. It's kind of wild. Um, any reactions to that? Any comments before I move forward?
I feel like I could hear a lot of like that boogie influence in that song.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. Like a very sort of like boogie that's shifting keys all over the place. It's like he can't decide what key he wants to be in, or he's just like atonal boogie. I kind of like that, or pantonal boogie. That's a new genre. Um, yeah. Any other reactions to that? Yeah, I didn't notice any handlebars in that piano. But anyway, um, so moving on, our next figure is actually the only non-pianist tonight, and I'm sorry, I'm really biased towards pianists just because I'm a pianist. Just how it worked out. But this is a person that I really admire as a composer and an improviser, but especially um, his compositions. So his name is Henry Threadgill, and he's also actually the only figure of tonight who's still with us. All the others have passed away. Um, Henry Threadgill is a saxophonist and composer, improviser. Born and raised in Chicago, he was equally influenced by jazz, classical, country music, polkas, gospel, boogie woogie. He draws on all of those sources. He played in all kinds of settings growing up. He played in orchestra. He played in marching bands. Played in blues bands. Played in gospel bands. Kind of all over the place musically. He served in the army in Vietnam and played in a rock band while he was there. He didn't actually engage in any combat, I don't think. One of the more central parts of his background is he was a member of the AACM, which is still the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music. So it's basically a group of people, a group of musicians, and that started in the mid '60s that were committed to doing the kind of music that they wanted to do for no commercial reasons, no other sort of like obligations. They just came together to support each other and encourage each other in their own uniqueness, of their individual voices. And they would all collaborate with each other, even though they were doing wildly different kinds of things. So some other figures that I wish I could have included tonight: the founder, Muhal Richard Abrams, another pianist, Anthony Braxton, who's also still around. He's a saxophonist and composer. George Lewis, who teaches at New York University, trombonist and composer. Some other figures that I'm blanking on right now, but anyway, they're still around now, and they do the music. It's interesting because like you can't really get a sense of what kind of music they do because it's not really categorizable by a genre because they're all drawing on their own unique sort of pool of things, and so they all sound very much like themselves, which is I think is a very beautiful thing. So he's had a bunch of different groups that's done many different kinds of things. I won't go through them right now. But in 2016, he actually won a Pulitzer Prize for music. If you were aware that, I think last year, Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize. Maybe it was 2 years ago. But it's the same prize. Henry Threadgill won it for his album Dirt and More Dirt in 2016. But you probably didn't hear about him or didn't remember him because he's not such an iconic figure like Kendrick. In the mainstream anyway. So a couple things before we listen to his music. He doesn't consider himself a jazz musician, although he's been lumped into that category. And jazz is kind of a contentious term among some jazz, well, I say among jazz musicians. They don't want to be called jazz musicians, but that's a larger conversation that can be had that I don't have time to get into right now. But I'm gonna just read a few of like Henry's thoughts on that. So his opinion, here we go. Jazz was a period. Cassandra Wilson just said that scatting belonged to a period that's over, and it's true. The idea of jazz was a period too, And if you allow the word to become bigger, it's always an expanding proposition. You got to remember something about black music in America. People start in the wrong places in trying to put together the history of black music. When you go back to blues in the Delta, there was no prototype, there was no template, there was no European example on how to formulate anything. The people just made that music from an aesthetic that they had come with them from Africa. They lost any containers or forms or approaches other than the aesthetic. Now, the entire experience of the slave was one of assimilation of anything. It didn't matter, Chinese, French, Spanish, whatever it was. It was the acquisition of all information in systems and knowledge and communication. It was just grab hold of something and learn how to do it in some kind of way and put your own voice in it. I'm saying all these things to say that I've always understood how music got created here in America and that I was under no obligation to do any particular thing. I do exactly the way I feel, whatever I want to do. And then, so we're going to listen to a couple of his tracks, and some things that I want you to listen for and keep in mind while you're listening is these compositions are notated. He wrote the parts down, but they're not limiting in the way that, so like his main priorities are freedom of possibilities and self-expression of the players in his band. So he rarely structures his compositions to have only one possible path. So like, a regular written piece, okay, it has a form, they follow the form, that's the way it is, that's the way it goes. There might be some slight variation within that, but there's one path and that's it. So you can almost think of his compositions as like a choose your own adventure book. He writes out possibilities, rehearses the band to be able to move comfortably through many of the possibilities, and then each performance can change depending on how the musicians are feeling that day or how he's feeling that day. So then they can take detours to all sorts of wild places because they've rehearsed all these possibilities. That's what makes the music feel so exciting to me. It's like the constant sense of newness and discovery and freshness when encountering the same piece of music. One quote of his is, "I keep trying to review ways to rehearse. That's the biggest thing now. How to instill information from different ways rather than from left to right. All kinds of different ways. Instill the information so that it gives me room to drop out stuff, to try stuff. And know that this stuff is deeply embedded into the minds of my fellow artists. That's the whole point, that I get the material deeply embedded. And all of the material, not a little bit of the information. So the more embedded it is in our minds, the more room we have to move." So this first one that we're going to listen to is called Devils on the Loose. Actually, the full title is Devils on the Loose and Dancing with a Monkey. One thing you'll notice is it has kind of an unusual instrumentation. It has two drummers, a bass player, a bass trombonist, and a cellist. So he really likes the low end and doubling up on the rhythm. And then also trumpet and alto sax. There's a really crazy cello solo in here. So any improvising cellist or wannabe improvising cellist, you can draw some inspiration from this because it is amazing. So here we go. Oh, hang on. Let me do something. Any reactions to that? Any thoughts on that one?
I dropped it in the chat, but to me it sounded like what it sounds like to get seduced by the devil.
Nice. Very, very descriptive. Yes, augmented fourths. Lots of augmented fourths. Yes, the devil's interval. That's right. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things I love about that. One, that there's two drummers, and so they're kind of like there's this kind of crazy rhythmic feel that's like undergirding the whole thing. Because they each have different senses of time, so it feels like the beat is like here, not here, but in a really good way. um, and then like the melody plays through once, and then the same melody happens at like double speed or something. Like it's like fast forward on the tape or something. Um, and then crazy cello solo, crazy bass solo, with the drums sort of like accompanying. And then at the end, I don't know if you noticed, the drums were actually playing the melody. If you were holding like the melody, the main melody that was happening, they were going do bum ba ba da right at the end when there's no other music happening. It's just an interesting little thing. Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I really loved how like each drummer was on like a different side. So like one was on the left, one was on the right.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like the bass drum was like in the middle, like maybe both bass drums were in the middle or something like that. But a lot of the cymbals were off to the side,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really cool. Um, yeah.
Yeah, you especially notice that. I feel like I particularly noticed that in the bass solo when they were kind of like doing this like trading back and forth. Yeah, whoever mixed this album, I don't know off the top of my head. Whoever mixed it did a very good job. Um, yeah. Um, I am going to run out of time if I play the second piece because it's like 10 minutes long. So I think for Henry Threadgill and the next person I'm going to cover, I'm going to play one of the tracks. Unfortunately, I wish there was more time because I want to leave a little bit of room for discussion at the end because I have a few discussion questions I want you all to talk about. Um, so, anything else? So, yeah, I've listed recordings of all these people, my favorite recordings of all these people, in a Google Doc that I will drop in the chat before we all leave so y'all can kind of check that out on your own time. Okay, so then our last figure is Jerry Allen, who is also someone, if you're kind of in, if you know, like you're an insider in jazz circles, and you probably have heard of her. But another, again, is another person who should get more attention than she does. She was born in Detroit, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Grew up, again, like Henry Threadgill, playing all different kinds of music, gospel and jazz and Motown. She was taking classical lessons as well, but she really prioritized learning things by ear. She's kind of worked with a bunch of people, all of like from mainstream jazz, so like people like Dave Holland and Jack DeJohnette, and Esperanza Spalding. More recently, Esperanza Spalding and Terry Lynn Carrington. And also, she's worked with some more avant-garde figures like Ornette Coleman and Muhal Richard Abrams, and actually Henry Threadgill is a recording of them playing together. So she's kind of all over the place. She draws from, she's like splits the middle between avant-garde and kind of mainstream. She was also known as an educator. She taught for a good number of years at University of Michigan and University of Pittsburgh. So she actually passed away 3 years ago from cancer. She was 59. So there's not really any bios of her yet that has, so, and she was also a very private person, so she didn't really give away a lot of personal information about herself, but I found some good interviews that I just want to quote a couple things so you just kind of get a sense of the kinds of things that she values. So I'm just going to read a few of her quotes here. So, I've always felt having my freedom in music was important. That's a part of my upbringing. I need to feel I can be versatile, to have the ability to move back and forth between different types of music. I'm attracted to the music of a large variety of great musicians. Then I synthesize all of it in a way that retains my freedom and my particular energy as an artist. in this far. Rhythm was also really important to her. So I just want to. This is her speaking. I just want it to have the kind of momentum that to make people feel something and move. You hear it in African drum choirs, where each drummer has an assigned rhythm. Same with George Clinton and Prince. Everyone has their spot and settles into it. I want my music to dance. Charlie Parker's music had that. James Brown makes me want to move. Cecil Taylor's music dances for me. To me, the greatest players are the ones who are the most rhythmic. I like to look at the piano as a drum, as 88 drums with pitch. Rhythm is the core of my music. If you want to be true to a tradition, you must find your own voice. It isn't just in playing what's already there. If you come to this music on its own terms, then you have to come to it. If you come to this music on its own terms, you have to come to it on your own terms. So I feel like that's a good setup for the one track that I'll play for her, and it's called A Celebration of All Life. It's from her first album called The Printmakers that she recorded in 84, 85, I think. Really fun piece of music. Very, very rhythmic. So here we go. Share screen. I wish I could share more of her because she is awesome. So if you're wondering what those strange sounds at the beginning were, it's the drummer doing body percussion. Andrew Cyril, the drummer who's still around. He's getting up there, but he's still around today. Yeah, and obviously you can hear this idea of like rhythm as a center of her music, right? It's like that pretty much defines most of the things that she's recorded. It's like that is what drives everything. Even things that are like free of time, rhythm is really still like a very present in her conception. Any reactions to that one?
It was such a pleasant surprise when the keys came in because I didn't I expected it to just be like a percussion piece, which would have been fine, but when the keys came in, it was really nice.
Yeah, and she like blended into that texture really well, right? It kind of, you heard her kind of like approaching the keyboard as a drum. She had like several different kinds of layers going on. Like in one hand, her left hand, she had two different kinds of rhythmic patterns going on, and her right hand was doing another rhythmic pattern, or just kind of going off and doing a bunch of crazy lines. Yeah. Any other reactions to that?
I loved like like how like Afrobeat almost it sounded in the beginning, and then almost like turning slightly like very Latin.
Mm-hmm.
Like with the keys, there was just something to the way that they played that was just so like it just screamed Latin to me. I could be completely mistaken, but that's how I interpreted it.
No, you're probably right. I mean, there's also a huge African influence on Latin music, right? And the rhythms that are going on. So there's definitely a lot of crossover between traditional African music and Latin musics, plural. Um, yeah. Any other thoughts? Because I think this will be the last recording before I close, and then there will be some brief discussion groups after. Any final words about anything that we've listened to or talked about? Okay. Oh wait, I heard somebody unmute.
Yeah, I just really quickly just wanted to say how Mary Lou Williams, like I was sitting on that piece for a little bit on the jazz choral, and it was like a summoning of something that I haven't heard since the first time I listened to Robert Johnson.
Mm, very nice. Yeah, I can definitely hear that. Yes, I can send. So what I'm gonna do, it will be a little bit easier. I can send the names of the pieces, or I can. What I'm gonna do is after the session's over, I'm gonna add the specific things that we listened to, that Google Doc, which actually I'm gonna drop now because I'm gonna forget later. So let me do that. Give me a second. Mm-hmm. So go ahead and open it now because the chat disappears after I close the meeting. So let me send. Wait, not waiting room people. Everyone in meeting. There we go. Okay. That should open up, and I'll edit it. So keep checking in. I'll be adding some more stuff to this. So keep checking in and seeing what I add. Cool. Yes, please click it now. Save the tab, otherwise it'll disappear. Or you can email me if you do happen to lose it. I'm happy to send it. I just want to read one last kind of block of a quote that I really like. And that will close out my portion before we break out into discussion. So I'll try to not take forever to read this. Okay, so get ready. You might not recognize some of the names in this because there's a lot of it's not name dropping, but there's a lot of like naming of names. So it might, some passages might feel a bit like the passages in the Bible where it's like so-and-so begat who and so-and-so begat. Bear with me. There's a point to it. Okay, here we go. Okay. It's written by Nicole Mitchell, who's a flutist and improviser composer, who's the current president, I believe, of the AACM, who Henry Threadgill that we listened to earlier was a member of. So that's a connection there. So here we go. Some lineages are written, some are spoken, and some are shared from one song to the next. Some are silent. Most of what we have from back then is, well, in pieces. Memory fragments woven with a little truth. The quilts that cover us today, they're a mix of blue, brown, white, black, and held together with lots of myth patches. That's what we are, actually, bits and pieces. My ears jumped backwards through time, tracing microscopic idea streams toward the music river. Was that Rasan Roland Kirk in Maya's quick-moving current, or was it the beckoning of the Malian fula flute in her ancestral memory? Did she know James Newton, who had beckoned me awake with multiphonic amazing grace, to strengthen my sound and trace my first waves into the seas of improvisation? They, the ancestors, are here, ideas pebbled into rocks, then mountains, to be sculpted slowly by the water's relentless movement towards fluidity and perfection, into majestic canyons. Did you notice? In the shoebox, some lines are broad, thick and dark, and easy to read and remember. They make towers that shadow, and everything branches to what we believe is home tree. Haven't you seen Bach and Beethoven and MLK standing there ominously, like columns of the big house? They might be building Sun Ra's next. My point, though, is there's more than branches to study. There's also silken threads, almost invisible to the glistening sunlight. They haven't been reinforced, so if you don't look carefully, you might miss the listening path of Pauline Oliveros. That would be a loss. That's what I fear. Memory fragments are woven in myths and truth. I heard about trains seeking a map from Gilmore, and that D. Alexander calls birdlines the light huff. Did Roscoe Mitchell flash a blueprint to Braxton, or did Vijay's fingers flicker some from Jerry Allen's silver sparks? Myra Melford strided to Erwin Heffler, and yeah, I thought I saw some Steve Coleman catch some microrhythmic vision from Threadgill. Did Mary Lou cascade that whole tone to Monk? Real or imagined, true or false, how much is a story told or lost? When is a connection important enough to be told? What makes an artist arrive? A door in the wall opens, and they stand there, hovering in the doorway just before making their entrance exit. In that doorway, they are seen by those who happen to be looking, but then again, they might not notice. A lot of people in the shoebox say that women aren't able or supposed to do such things, and yet, she is a woman and she is black. Did it matter? Many like her carried jewels and passed them successfully through the memory stream to others, but there might not be any recollection of their source. Some threads, intense in brightness, are hidden treasures to climb towards. Fred Anderson and Butch Morris opened the wall big enough for whole musician schools of experimental collaboration to appear. And yet, like I said, everything is incomplete, or we wouldn't need to be here. Those silken threads I was talking about earlier, they hold our communities together. If we forget them, we are nothing. They might be more critical to our survival than we think. I know those broad, beautiful lines of Langston Hughes, Jesus, and Armstrong have been guideposts, but aren't you tired of going in circles and ending up back at the big house? After all, the towers are meticulously cared for by the shoebox architects. They built them so we'd remember our legacy in their frame. But our silken threads, those are our network designers. They're illumined and know the essentials to tie us together. They are what was feared lost. Without each other, we are nothing. Can we really progress into something better, or do we just go deeper into who we really are? We've shaped our plans on linear lines, liner notes of individual progress while stepping on our silken thread sisters and brothers in the maze. Closing her eyes, a child submitted to the warm darkness enveloping her. This is where all sound, dreams, and ideas lived. A cloudy, dark purple space where forms emerged from formlessness. Some familiar, some new. In this space of memory, of future, she found an alignment between those that are remembered and those that are forgotten. They would appear and dissolve into patterns, and sometimes plants or caverns. There was no significance or insignificance here. Faces would stare, sometimes frightfully, but always silent. I know that was long, but I felt that there was a lot of important information and important advice in there. One more tiny thing, a tiny stanza of a poem that I want to finish out with. This is by one of my favorite poets, Thomas Transtromer, and it's kind of related to this idea of the history is not as far away as we think it is, and we can those voices, those figures still live on, and we can choose to listen to them or not. So this is an excerpt of a poem by Transtromer. Sometimes an abyss opens between Tuesday and Wednesday, but 26 years may pass in a moment. Time is not a straight line. It's more of a labyrinth, and if you press close to the wall at the right place, you can hear the hurrying steps and the voices. You can hear yourself walking past on the other side. So that concludes my portion of tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it and got some interesting music, and I hope you take these and make your own discoveries and find your own sort of invisible threads that you can incorporate into your own lives, into your own music. So, without further ado, I think. Oh my goodness, that would have been amazing. Jerry Allen live with Esperanza Spalding and Terry Lynn. I am very jealous. So what's going to happen now is, if you're willing to bear a little bit longer, I don't want to go within 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to send you all into breakout rooms, and I've come up with a few discussion questions that can maybe like get you a little deeper into some of these ideas that I've talked about. I know it's late, but I think there's some good things to be had here. So I'm going to disperse you all into breakout rooms. There's a lot of people. Wow. Okay. Let's see how this goes. So actually, I have a few discussion questions so that my grad assistants here will help steer the conversation. And they have these written down, but I'm just going to go ahead and say them now. These are the questions I had in mind. Who are your invisible threads? They don't have to be in music. They can be any field of thought or creation. Why do you find their voices important? That's the first one. Do you think that the fact that certain voices are overlooked or intentionally marginalized is harmful for the wider community? Why or why not? If so, what are some concrete steps that we can take to make sure their voices are remembered? The third question is, what are your personal musical artistic values? What personal values match with the dominant prevalent ones? And where do your personal values differ from them? Fourth one is, have you personally experienced any conflicts between your personal values and the dominant ones? How do you navigate those conflicts? So if you don't get to all of them, that's totally fine, but just plenty of things to talk about in your rooms. Yes, thank you all. For those who are leaving, thank you all for joining. I really appreciate you being here. All right. So for those who are staying in breakout rooms, I'm going to send you all out.